Good evening. Tonight's class is the Mourning After, the Jewish view on grief, on mourning, and also we will follow with technical etiquette for Jewish etiquette for the Shiva house and what to say, what not to say, what to do, what not to do. As the Talmud says elsewhere, that just as it's important to say certain things certain times, it's as important and sometimes more important to not say things sometimes. And in the words of the Talmud, mila b'sela shtika b'trei. A word may be worth $1, but silence is worth $2. I'm not sure what that says about the amount of talking I do. So discussing these ideas will be an interesting adventure. And the reason I say that is because until now, we've been talking about kind of abstract, kind of very spiritual ideas with leaving it for us to figure out the connection between these spiritual ideas and how to implement them. And tonight we're going to talk about the practicality. And so it brings to mind an interesting parable. Some say it's an actual story, may have happened. It brings to mind a story where there was a stuntman who once stretched a rope from one end of Niagara Falls to the other, and he would tightrope across Niagara Falls in front of a large crowd, and successfully, and everyone would cheer and everyone would clap and scream, you know, what an amazing stuntman, he can do it. And he gets up on the rope once again, and he announces to everyone, and he says, so who thinks I can cross the tightrope blindfolded? And they all scream, of course, we believe, we know you can do it. And lo and behold, he crosses the tightrope blindfolded. And once again, he comes to the other end and he announces, so who believes that I can cross the tightrope with a wheelbarrow? And they all scream, of course, we know you can do it. And he takes the wheelbarrow and he walks across the tightrope perfectly, doesn't shake, it doesn't move, he doesn't slip, and he makes it to the other side. Now he turns to the crowd and he says, so who believes that I can cross the tightrope with a person in the wheelbarrow? And everyone says, of course, we believe you can do it. So he says, all right, who's going to volunteer to hop in? And there's a deafening silence. This idea is this story, this parable is an exact idea of what we're going to discuss today, the difference between theoretical and practical. Tonight, we're going to discuss a little bit more practical, especially when it comes to the Shiva discussions of the details of Shiva, but the grief process, the mourning process, and the steps the Torah gives us for these mourning processes. And it's important as an introduction, we'll begin with text 1, to understand the difference between experiences of loss. Everyone experiences things differently. And text 1 is an interesting, unfortunate story of a woman. And in text 2, we have another story of another woman who took grief in really opposite directions. Text 1, student page 84. Heather Lindquist was in the kitchen cleaning up after lunch when she heard a dull thud. It sounded as if it came from the hallway, and it was just a little too loud to ignore. Boys, she yelled, what are you up to? There was no answer. She found her 2 boys playing quietly on the couch in the living room. They giggled. You jokers, she said with a smile. What was that sound? They shrugged. Where is your father? Without waiting for an answer, she ran toward the hallway. She cried out in fear when she found her husband, John, writhing on the floor. John had severe asthma. He was taking a new medication, and it had seemed to be working. But suddenly he had collapsed in the worst attack he'd ever had. Heather tried everything she could think of to save her husband's life. Then she called an ambulance. The rest was a blur. John died of cardiac arrest on the way to the hospital. Heather was 34 years old. Her boys were 5 and 7. At that moment, John's death felt like the worst thing that could have ever happened to her. Heather Lindquist had lived her entire life in the same quiet suburban community in northern New Jersey. She and John had been high school sweethearts. They married and purchased a small ranch-style house. They had children, they got a dog. The schools were good and the community was stable. Heather thought that the television was on more than it should be, but other than that, everything seemed in order. Then John died and she had to rethink it all. Now she was a single parent. She had to find new ways to earn money and also find extra time to be with her boys. And somehow she had to contain everyone's anguish. She found strength she didn't know she had. It was lonely and painful at times. But Heather found meaning and vigor and even joy in the idea that she was going to make it. I expected to collapse. I really did. That's what I wanted to do. That would have been the easiest thing to do, Heather explained. But I couldn't. Each day I got up and did what I had to do. The days passed and somehow it was okay. The boys were great. They were upset in the beginning, of course. We all were. They hung in there and we stayed together. I love these boys so much. John would have been proud of them. Tremendous perseverance on Heather's part. But here's another story that tells the other side of the coin. Text 2, page 86, from an article in the New York Times in 2009. In 2004, Stephanie Moldberg of Short Hills, New Jersey, lost her son, Eric, 13, to Ewing sarcoma, a bone cancer. Ewing sarcoma, a bone cancer. 4 years after Eric's death, Miss Moldberg, now 48, walked around like a zombie. I felt guilty all the time. Guilty about living, she said. I couldn't walk into the deli because Eric couldn't go there any longer. I couldn't play golf because Eric couldn't play golf. My life was a mess. And I couldn't talk to my friends about it because after a while, they didn't want to hear about it. Stephanie, you need to get back to your life, they'd say. But how could I? On birthdays, I'd shut the door and take the phone off the hook. Eric couldn't have any more birthdays. Why should I? When we analyze these two stories, the obvious questions come up from a philosophical perspective and from an emotional perspective. Heather and Stephanie reacted very, very differently to their respective losses. Is one of these responses healthier than the other? Is Heather in denial by persevering? Is Stephanie overreacting? We may know someone who reacted in one of these two ways, or we may react in one of these two ways. What's going on here? And so it's important to understand that Heather is not living in denial and Stephanie isn't overreacting. Everyone reacts differently. There is no correct way to react to a loss. Heather didn't see another option. This is the way she saw she had to go move forward for her children. And Stephanie wasn't overreacting. We may have to look at circumstances. Maybe the circumstances were somewhat different. And even if they weren't different, even if the circumstances were exactly the same, different people respond differently. And so with that in mind, in considering the differences between everyone's situation, where in this case, Heather, we're talking about an older person who passed away, not old, but older. One is a parent, one is a spouse, one is a child. There's different reactions to that. One was a prolonged illness, one was a short illness. One had children, one may not have had other children. But ultimately, it really doesn't matter because no two people are alike and no two circumstances are alike. And so before we discuss if and what the better way to mourn is, it's very important to keep that in mind that human beings respond to and cope with a loss in various ways. And there's no experience, there's no mourning experience which is better or worse. And so what we're going to explain today is someone who is experiencing chronic grief, someone who is experiencing paralyzing grief, what does the Torah say? How do we lessen that grief? How do we ameliorate that pain and reemerge into life? And so we'll see how the Torah guides us through the difficult times of the passing of a loved one. We're going to focus on ideas that we've discussed in the past two classes and understand how those play out into the weeks and months and years following the passing of a loved one. And so first we're going to look at the Torah's view, how the Torah views mourning and grief, and how one should act following a loss, how one should be comforted. Next, we'll discuss Torah principles that will help a person, hopefully, deal with chronic grief. And thirdly, we're going to discuss the proper etiquette for friends and family who come to visit in a shiva. So before we move on, we're going to take a step back and we're going to ask a very basic question. And the basic question is, throughout history and throughout philosophy, we find some great philosophers who shunned mourning, shunned grief, and on the contrary, great philosophers who thought that death wasn't a big deal. It's not something to cry about. And as we'll see, that there's some seemingly valid arguments that may be applicable to the Jewish point of view. And what we're going to read here is a quote from Socrates. Socrates was a interesting person, to say the least. And he had this annoying habit. His habit was to challenge received wisdom. And the other philosophers in ruling class of the time didn't really appreciate that, to say the least. And it reached a point where he was sentenced to death. Just before the execution was carried out, he had a conversation with one of his students, with Phaedo, and later Phaedo related that conversation to Plato, who transcribed it in his book Phaedo. During the course of the conversation, Socrates asked his disciple Cebes to give over the following message to all of his disciples, and primarily to his disciple, to his other disciple, Evines. So this is what Socrates said shortly before his passing. Dr. Herman, would you like to read text 3? It's on page 87.
I don't have my book open, Rabbi. It'd take me too long.
All right. Ruchama, would you like to read text 3?
Okay, yes. Okay. Phoebes, please relate the following message to Evanus and bid him be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come by after me, by immediately leaving a wise man. And I am likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must. Simmias said, "What, as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he is obliged." "Why," said Socrates, "is not Evanus a philosopher?" "I think that he is," said Simmias.
Then I think we lost you. Okay.
I got it.
Shmuel, go ahead.
I think.
Okay, this is on page 88.
Page 87.
Okay, where do you want me to start?
Start from the beginning because it was a little choppy.
Cebes, please relate the following message to Venus and bid him to be of good cheer. Say that I would have him come after me by immediately leaving this world, if he be a wise man, and not tarry, and that today I'm likely to be going, for the Athenians say that I must. Simmias said, What a message for such a man. Having been a frequent companion of his, I should say that as far as I know him, he will never take your advice unless he is obliged. Why? Said Socrates. Is not Venus a philosopher? I think that he is, said Simmias. Then he, or any man who has the spirit of philosophy, will be willing to die. But he will not take his own life, for that is held to be unlawful. The day may come when you will understand why, though a man is better dead, he is not permitted to take his own benefactor, but must wait for the hand of another.
Thank you. So we see here Socrates is pretty clear. It's a cause for excitement. It's a cause for joy, death, and people should choose their own death. And the reason is because in Greek philosophy, similar to Jewish philosophy, was the idea that man has a soul, there's an afterlife, and that's when the soul is unshackled. And so why be here in a shackled life? We should rejoice when we leave this shackled life. And as a matter of fact, at that point, Socrates had a chance to escape. And he refused to take that chance because he was worried that other people may see that he has may claim that he has a fear of death, and he wanted to show that he has no fear of death, because really that's what any wise person should choose. But obviously Judaism does not agree with that, with a resounding non-agreement. And as we see in text 4, Maimonides, we are biblically commanded to mourn the deaths of our next of kin. It's not just an idea. It's not just a nice thing. It's not just something which is natural. It's an actual commandment in the Torah to mourn the passing of the next of kin. And the question is why? Why doesn't Judaism agree with Socrates? He has a valid argument. And based on what we discussed in lessons 1 and 2, seemingly there's something to it. We believe in the immortality of the soul. We believe in the afterlife. And we discussed the various reasons associated with why we believe that this world is actually of greater importance than the afterlife. But what's with the mourning? Why is the mourning so important? And so we'll see in text 5, A, B, and C, from various sages throughout the ages, that the various purposes of mourning. Betsy, would you like to read on page 89, 5A, B, and C? You'll have to unmute first.
Okay. The Torah does not forbid us to weep in response to a death, because it is human nature to be moved to tears when separating from loved ones and at their journeying away, even if they are alive. Let's go on.
Yeah, 5B.
Mourners find comfort in crying and in arousing their sorrow until their bodies are too weak to handle the intensity of their internal turmoil. Just as happy individuals find contentment in various forms of lighthearted activities.
Continue. 5C.
Question. One of these generation's greatest personalities failed to shed a single tear upon losing a son. Is this a praiseworthy reaction? Is this a praiseworthy reaction? Such behavior is offensive and objectionable. It demonstrates heartlessness, distasteful character, and cruelty. This is the way of the philosophers who maintain that the world is without purpose. By contrast, we who have received the Torah are expected to believe and to realize that this world is of great value for those who properly utilize their time here and behave appropriately. It is through our actions in this world that we merit the world to come. Crying, mourning, and shedding tears over the passing of a relative, especially for an honorable individual, is the way of pious, the prophets, and individuals renowned for their good deeds. It is not for naught that our sages instruct us to observe 3 days for weeping, 7 for eulogies, and 30 for restrictions on wearing new clothing and getting haircuts. If weeping were improper, the sages would not have instituted a 3-day weeping period. In fact, the Torah emphasizes that our forefather Abraham came to eulogize Sarah and weep for her, and that Jacob, King David, and countless individuals of similar caliber acted likewise.
So what we have here are 3 texts that take it from one step to the next. 5a tells us that not only is weeping and mourning not a bad thing, but it's allowed. It's permissible. It's nature. It's what we do as human beings. It's human nature to mourn the loss of a loved one. Maimonides takes it a step further in 5b, and he says not only it's allowed, but it's actually comforting. It's helpful. It's helpful for ourselves. And in text 5c, the Radvaz, the famous commentator who we quoted, sage who we quoted on numerous occasions in earlier classes, takes it an even greater step and says not only is it beneficial, not only is it allowed and beneficial, but it's also expressing a Jewish theological truth. So not only is it allowed and is it proper and helpful, but it's expressing a Jewish theological truth. God created this world for a reason. And the reason was to live in this physical world and to do everything that we possibly can in this physical world to make this world a better place. As we explained in lesson 1, the idea of life. And so in this world, when someone leaves this world, it's important to mourn. It's helpful, it's important. Which leads us, as you can see on page 92, what are the next of kin according to Torah? What is a person's next of kin? Who are the obligated mourners for which next of kin according to Torah? When someone's mother passes, father, spouse, sibling, son, or daughter. Those are called mourners avelim according to Torah. What is the mourning process? According to Torah, the mourning process is comprised of 5 time periods. The first one is immediately following the passing of a loved one until the burial. That is called aninut, and the individual is called an onem. That's the immediate step of mourning. During that step of mourning, and we'll discuss it a little bit later as well, during that step of mourning, it's the most intense phase of mourning, and at this point, no attempt should be made whatsoever to console the mourners. It's in the deepest moment of mourning, it's the intense grief that follows the passing of a loved one. And in the words of the ethics of our fathers, it says, do not comfort an individual when their loved one is lying before them. It's so intense that the Code of Jewish Law tells us that at that time, this individual is not obligated to fulfill any of the positive commandments of the Torah. It's not obligated to put on tefillin, not obligated to do the prayers, not obligated to say Shema, because right now they are preoccupied with this intense level of grief. Once the loved one is buried, and practically speaking, nowadays, that level of intense grief lifts a little bit earlier before the burial, because the obligation of burial and the logistics around that are passed on to the Chevra Kadisha, the burial society. And so once they take responsibility of the burial process, then in a number of areas, this intense level of mourning is lifted. But it ends at the final moments just before burial, where the immediate family members, the next of kin, tear the outer part of their outer garments. Following that, we have the shiva, which we'll explain at length later on in tonight's class. 7-day mourning period. The Hebrew word shiva means 7. Following that period, following the shiva, we have the shloshim. Shloshim means the 30 days. The 30-day period, which commences with interment. One is supposed to avoid new clothing, no haircuts, no festive events, and various other laws. Obviously, this overview is just that, an overview. It's not an in-depth legal detailed description of all the laws that are necessary at the time. Following the shloshim, we have the 4th period, which is the 12-month period, which is more important and more applicable when it's the passing of a parent. Some of the shloshim restrictions continue, like avoiding festive events, weddings, or especially joyous occasions. And it's customary for a parent, for mourning the passing of a parent, to keep a candle burning for the full 12 months consecutively. So if you've ever been to a kosher market and you've seen those long 7-day candles, that's what it's for. It's for the shiva, and then those are kept on burning for the passing, following the passing of a loved one, for the parent, following the passing of a parent, for an entire year. And then the 5th period is one that we all experience on various levels, and that is that of a yahrzeit. The anniversary of passing, where we recite the Kaddish, we do additional Torah study, we do extra good deeds, give charity, do extra Torah study in the memory and merit of the deceased. And that is the general mourning process according to Torah. And so it's interesting to note that up until 1980s, and I'm not a psychologist, and so those of you who are a little bit more well-versed in psychology can correct me on the details of this, but until the 1980s, psychological studies of grief and coping with the loss of loved ones focused on 2 different areas. There were 2 distinct psychological studies. One category, which we'll call track 1, focused on the function of the bereaved. How are they reintegrating with society after the passing of a loved one? How is their relationships holding up? How are they doing coping at work, coping at family? And are they caring about life in general? How are they functioning as a member of society? The extent of change, the difficulty following the loss were treated in their own rights and not in the context of which it was caused. The other category, which was discussed and analyzed by other researchers and clinicians, was what we'll call in track 2, was the spiritual side. This, not spiritual in the sense of spiritual, but the idea of their relationship to the deceased. What was their relationship? How deep was their relationship? How are they affected by this separation? How are they keeping this closeness with the deceased going? And it was 2 distinct studies until there was a professor in the University of Haifa. His name was Dr. Simon Shimshon Rubin, who came up with the model, the 2-track model of bereavement. And I'm not going to go through it. You can have a look at it on page 94, figure 3.3, the 2-track model of bereavement. Takes a few minutes to figure out what's going on and to analyze it. And I'll give you 2 minutes just to have a look at it, to see what it's expressing, and then we'll give an overview on it. So what Dr. Rubin really analyzed and discovered was that we have to put these two areas together. We have to put the functional piece and the relational piece together because they mirror each other. How functional one is based on how they are coping with this separation of the deceased and their relationship with the deceased. And so he explained that this idea of someone being more engaged at work, maintaining relationships and other interests, really worked hand in hand with the mourner's connection with the deceased, with how they're dealing with the separation from the deceased, and at every step of the way. And he took it a step further and explained that the Torah laws and customs are divinely inspired, and therefore they actually work hand in hand with this level. And so, as you can see on page 96, he went ahead and he explained that that moment of aninus is a time for the mourner not to be involved with society. It's not a time to function. And Torah tells us as much. Torah says that this is not the time for this individual to function. So much so that even the biblical positive commandments of putting on tefillin, of studying Torah, of saying the Shema, which are of paramount importance, right now he's not obligated. He or she are not obligated to do those mitzvahs because they are not functioning in this world. Right now, they are focusing on their intense connection with the deceased. That's what that moment is for. And we have to respect that and not try to comfort them. Let the mourners be in this intense level of grief. Moving on to the shiva. The shiva is a 7-day period. It's a 7-day period where it's a little bit more functionality, but still not, as we shall soon see, involved in the world. Still no business dealings, still no comings and goings, because right now it's still a lack of function because the relationship with the deceased is still very intense. And so on and so forth. As it moves out of that intense grief and it moves to a slightly lighter grief and lighter mourning, so too does the functionality become more readily functioning as a regular person, back to society, back to the way it was. Obviously, it'll never be back to normal. It's never back to the way it was beforehand, because everyone gets affected till the end of life, but as functional as possible. And so really that's what we're going to explain in the next section, is this idea that Torah tells us that when it comes to grief, when it comes to mourning, when it comes to the pain, to the suffering, and to the sorrow, there's a right way and there's a wrong way. There's a time for intense grief and there's a time for lighter grief. And in order to enable us, in order to enable mourners to grieve in the best way possible, this is what Torah is presenting as the system, the proper system, to grieve and to mourn, to enable a person to do it properly. Stop for a moment for some questions before we continue. Are grief and mourning being used synonymously? In the beginning, as we move on closer to towards the end of the class, we're going to separate them somewhat. It would seem that a mourner would need consoling and companionship, and immediately following loved one's passing, grief is most intense. That's a good point, but the reality is not so much. At that immediate moment, right now, they just need to be in their own grief. They need to experience it. Because when that grief, as we shall soon see, Torah is telling us that when that grief isn't experienced the way it should be, then it'll stay with them as the weeks and months and years progress. And so it may seem like this is the moment they need us most. It may seem like, but right now, what they need us is to be quiet. What they need from us, what mourners need from us, is those moments, is that deep connection, that intense connection, and that intense sorrow and grief that they're having over the deceased. The time will come. It may come that next day, and that day immediately following interment. It may come even before interment if the Chevra Kadisha takes over the logistics, and then it continues throughout the Shiva. But as we'll see, even during the Shiva, there's certain etiquette that Torah tells us that's for the benefit of the mourner, to enable them to process that grief in the best way possible. What does it mean to provide merit to the deceased in the next world? We're going to, thank you, it's a good question. We're going to focus on that when we towards the end of the class. So now, what are those moments of grief? The moments of grief, and what does Torah tell us about the processing of the grief? The processing of the grief begins just before the interment. The first element, and a very important element of mourning, is the acceptance of this new painful reality, not to be in denial. And for some people, immediately after one's passing, there's a freeze, there's a numbness, or to a certain degree, by many people, a denial. And so the Torah tells us that the first action that should be done to express that grief is the rending of garments, tearing the garments over the outer garment over the heart. And we see this first time that it's mentioned is in the book of Genesis, when Joseph goes missing, and they explain to their father, the brothers explain to their father Jacob, and they let him come to the conclusion that Joseph was killed. And what does Joseph do? What does Jacob do? Text 6, the brothers slaughtered a goat and dipped Joseph's tunic in its blood. They sent the colored tunic home, and the couriers brought it to their father and said, "We have found this. Please identify whether or not it is your son's tunic." Jacob recognized it and exclaimed, "It is my son's tunic. A wild beast has devoured him. Joseph has been torn to pieces." Jacob rent his garments, placed sackcloth on his loins, and mourned his son for many days. Tearing one's garment, especially in front of a crowd, is a powerful expression of pain and sorrow. And even more than that, tearing a garment really gives an individual a tangible expression and the inescapable reality that something has just occurred. It kind of opens up those tears or that grief for someone who's been trying to live in denial or numb with grief, to open up and to begin processing that grief and allowing it, that painful reality, to finally sink in. In the words of famous 18th century sage Rabbi Yehuda Ayash, in his responsa on page 98, Rabbi Yaakov Chagiz states that mourners are instructed to rend their garments as a method of distracting from and reducing their overwhelming grief. In my humble opinion, the opposite is true. Having to rend their garments brings mourners to tears and amplifies their pain. The goal is to actively encourage mourners to express their pain over the passing and to experience their tremendous loss. That is the purpose of tearing garments. To allow the mourner to experience and to let that painful reality sink in, which is followed by the shiva. Just an important note to mention, there's been a American creation of the black ribbon, and some of us may have seen it at funeral homes or at cemeteries, the black ribbon where a little button is placed on the lapel of the mourner, and that little ribbon is torn. And really, if we analyze the idea, as we just explained, the purpose of tearing the garments, it's to tap into the deepest wells of our humanity. And we're trying to express this deep grief that we have, this deep anguish, this sacred moment It should be done in its most sacred manner, in the way that the Torah tells us it should be done, with the actual garment of the actual individual, the actual mourner. To reduce that to a mere ribbon, to something that's meaningless, to something that's just a creation of funeral home directors, to go ahead and do it on that, misses the entire point. Aside from it not fulfilling the law, it misses the entire point. As a matter of fact, according to law, someone who did the kriya, the rending of garments, and did it on a ribbon, when they come home and the mourner comes home, they actually have to they have to say the blessing and they have to do it again because it didn't count. We don't want to reduce it to something that's meaningless. It's real, it's deep, it's important. Which brings us to the next step, and that is shiva. When someone's mourning the loss of a loved one, and they've reached that point, they've accepted the pain, they're acknowledging the depth of the pain. We then have to move on to processing this pain, to processing this grief, because taking time to focus on the pain, to accepting it, acknowledging it, and taking time to process this grief and this sorrow and to mourn is critical to the healing process. But only when the mourning and the grief is a forward-moving, active endeavor. When it moves along in the system that's provided by Torah. Because if we, as I mentioned earlier, if we fail to sufficiently mourn at the time when it's necessary, ironically, that holds us back, and months or even years later, that danger of deteriorating, of not being able to be reincorporated in society, that danger of depression that can follow even years later, is ever more real. If the mourners allow themselves to experience the intense grief and then to process it for the full 7 days, the shiva. Shiva, the Hebrew word shiva, means 7 days. To process it. Torah is telling us that a person needs 7 days to process it. 3 days is not enough. That's why it's called shiva, not shloisha. 3 days isn't enough. 7 days is necessary to process this grief. Only then will we be able to move on to the next step. For a moment for a question. Is there any part of the grief? Is there any part of the grief period also to help the soul that is leaving this world? Yes, we addressed it in the last class at length, that really the entire grieving period is to mourn with the soul, not only to mourn this passing, but to mourn with the soul who's, as we explained at length the last class, who's finds this separation very troubling, very hard from a spiritual point of view and from a literal point of view. So definitely. Which brings us to the next step. And that next step is that according to Torah, following mourning, there has to be the comfort. We can't mourn forever. The loss of a loved one is natural. It's a commandment. It's beneficial. It's best and the most important coping mechanism, but we aren't meant to stay in this step forever. As we'll see in text 8, a quote from the Talmud. Mora Devora, would you like to read text 8 on page 99?
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah.
Go ahead.
Neither cry for the dead nor bemoan him. Neither cry for the dead more than necessary, nor bemoan him more than what is prescribed. How are we expected to act? 3 days for weeping, 7 days for eulogies, and 30 days for restrictions on new clothing and haircuts. Once these have elapsed, God declares, "You are not more compassionate than I."
Thank you. So that's a quote from the Talmud. What the Talmud in short is saying, to paraphrase, is that while Torah encourages and compassionately validates and the mourning and the grieving process, but Torah is very insistent that when the proper time comes, we got to move on to normal life. We can't stay in that level, in that place forever. So there's no question that everyone mourns differently. There's no question that for some people, 3 days of weeping is not enough. As the Torah says, we mentioned last week, 3 days is intense weeping. There's no question for some people, 3 days is not enough. And for other people, after 2 days, they're ready to go back to work. They're ready to get up and go to the market and do whatever they got to do. But the Torah is telling us that for everyone, it's imperative, it's important, it's a mitzvah, it's of utmost necessity that we have to experience the full grieving process, the intense grieving of the first day, then the intense weeping in the following 3 days, and then the full shiva experience. Even if we feel ready, we're not. But following the 7 days, Torah is telling us we got to move on. We have to force ourselves through actions, and those actions will affect us internally. And obviously, this doesn't take the place of going to professionals deal with these issues. If it's someone feels that they're falling into depression or chronic grief and they'd like to speak to someone, this doesn't take the place. We can't just plow through because that's what Torah says. This gives us an understanding of what Torah's perspective is, and when it comes to important serious considerations, then we have to speak to the appropriate medical professionals, mental health professionals, and the likes. And so, how do we find comfort? How do we move on? How can a mourner, especially someone who's experiencing intense grief, move on? And so now we're going to look at some ideas from Torah, and really the first powerful idea from Torah that gives us and gives the mourners the tools to move on. And that is the famous statement, which is said at every mourner's house. If we've ever been to a shiva house, sometimes there are signs that say it. Some of us are more knowledgeable, and we've said it, unfortunately, one time too many. And so we know this statement, and we'll read it on page 100, text 9a. Hamakim, in Hebrew, Hamakim Yenachem Eschem B'Seir Sha'ar Avei L'Tzion V'Yerushalayim. May the omnipresent God console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem. This is the statement that we say, that we tell mourners upon leaving the shiva. We come to visit, we talk about whatever the mourner would like to talk about, and then, or we come there to pray, and then we stand up and we're about to leave and we say this. This is the comforting statement that we tell them. Why? Why should we wish them this statement? Why would we say, I'd like to comfort you? When we only experience happy occasions from now on. Why isn't that sufficient? Or may you be consoled by your friends, by your family. What's this insistence of mentioning that God should console you along with the other mourners of Zion and Jerusalem? Where does Zion and Jerusalem land here? And so the idea that's expressed here is a powerful one. First and foremost, we're telling the mourner, there's nothing that I can say that will comfort you. Your loss is unimaginable. I can't comfort you. I'm not experiencing it. Even if I've experienced loss in the past, that doesn't help you with your loss. And so there is no way that I can comfort you. Only God can comfort you. God can heal you. Sometimes time is a healer because God will comfort you through that measure of time. But only God can heal you. Additionally, there's various points that this statement expresses. The subsequent text, this next text that we're going to read, and another text that we're going to read at the end of the class, and one more that we'll read in lesson 6, is taken from a letter that the Rebbe penned to, at the time, General Arik Sharon. More recently, he was the Prime Minister of Israel. But before that, he was a very famous and heroic general who led the Israeli army in the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, and he heroically was the one that led the IDF all the way to Egypt, if I recall correctly, unless he was in the northern border in Syria. Either way, he was the heroic general. And in 1967, after surviving many wars, 56 and 48 and so on, he lost his son to a training accident in Israel. His beloved son, Gur, who I believe was only 20 at the time, was killed in a training accident in Israel. And the Rebbe heard about it, and the Rebbe penned a very long letter, a short while later, to comfort him. And in this letter, the Rebbe explains various points about this statement that we tell mourners. And this letter is what actually began a very deep and long relationship between General Sharon and the Rebbe, who had come many times to meet the Rebbe in person and discuss very sensitive ideas and strategic discussions with the Rebbe. Text 9b. Shmuel, would you like to read? Bob, you have to unmute yourself. There we go.
In regard to Zion and Jerusalem, the Romans, and before them the Babylonians, were given dominion only over the wood, stone, silver, and gold of the temple's physical manifestation, but not over its inner spiritual essence contained within the heart of each and every Jew. Over this, the nations have no dominion, and it stands eternally. So too, regarding the mourning of the individual, death dominates only the physical body and concerns of the deceased person. The soul, however, is eternal. It has merely ascended to the world of truth.
Even physical matter is indestructible. It just changes form. How much more so when we're talking about the spiritual aspect of an individual? The soul, it's immortal, lives on forever. It lives on forever. It's immune to the forces that deteriorate the body. And so what we're telling the mourner is, after we tell them that main point that there's nothing I can say to console you because only God is who heals and who comforts, we tell the mourner that it's just like Zion and Jerusalem. Yes, the temple was destroyed. Yes, we no longer see the temple. But we pray for it every day. We think about it every day, and it's still holy. The Temple Mount is still there because that soul of the temple is indestructible. So too, the soul of your loved one is indestructible. We're drawing this parallel in order to give this comforting thought, which in fact is also a deeper meaning for why we rend the garments. Text 10, page 102. Often within their pain, the mourners have an underlying belief that it isn't true, that their loved one hasn't really gone. This is not just denial. In a way, they're right. Death is not an absolute reality. Our souls existed before we were born. They continue to exist after we die. The souls that have passed on are still with us. We can't see them, but we sense that they are there. We can't hear them, but we know that they hear us. On the surface, we are apart. Beyond the surface, nothing can separate us. So we tear our garments. This has a dual symbolism. We are recognizing the loss that our hearts are torn, but ultimately the body is also only a garment that the soul wears. Death is when we strip off one uniform and take on another. The garment may be torn, but the essence of the person within it is still intact. From our worldly perspective, death is indeed a tragedy, and the sorrow experienced by the mourners is real. But as they tear their garments, we hope that within their pain, they can sense a glimmer of a deeper truth, that souls never die. And so when we internalize this concept, we can look at death, and death loses its absolute finality. And this understanding has the power to comfort the mourner. And now the mourner can slowly return to life. In an ideal situation, a person going through the process of mourning will, with time, find the inner strength to continue living, to do back to somewhat normal. God instilled within us the power for resiliency. God instilled within us the power to the ability to live fully regardless of the circumstances we may encounter throughout life. But sometimes we reach a point where a person feels that they're stuck. They're stuck. There are people who, as we mentioned in the beginning, people who can't move on. They have this grief that continues forever, seemingly forever. It just goes on and on. What does Torah tell about to someone who has this grief that seems to move on? And really, when a loved one passes, various people have different emotional reactions and feelings, and some people can have numerous emotional feelings associated with the passing of a loved one. Just a moment. Sorry about that. There's various feelings that one can experience and various emotions that one experiences with the passing of a loved one that can keep us stuck. What are those various feelings, the various emotions? I'm sure we can all think of some that some people experience, but we'll focus on two of the more common ones. There's injustice, guilt, depression, sadness, anger. These are the more common emotions that are expressed following the passing of a loved one. And we're going to focus on two. We're going to focus on the injustice aspect. We're going to focus on the guilt, the anger. And really what we're going to focus on here will help us understand all and any emotional reactions that mourners may have following the passing of a loved one. The feeling of injustice is a common one. Anger, especially when we're not talking about someone who lived to the ripe old age of 120, someone who passed early, someone who passed before their prime, or someone who passed way before we felt that they should have passed. So like, why should that have happened? Obviously, that feeling of injustice is different than between someone who reached an older age and lived a happy life and someone who reached the age of 25 and got hit by a car. When someone has a great grandmother that passed at the age of 120, they don't necessarily feel that feeling of injustice or guilt. They may have sadness. They may want to live in denial, but that will probably pass after a short time. When it's someone younger, that's different. But the reality is that these feelings are there. And so we're going to take a page out of the book of one of the greatest sages of all time, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the sage, the leader of the Jewish people at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple, the year 69 of the Common Era. He led the Jewish people, and during the time, one of the most trying times for the Jewish nation. He dealt with his community members through loss, through sorrow, through enslavement, through unthinkable and unspeakable tragedies. Yet when it came to the passing of his own son, a young son who passed, he couldn't be comforted. He couldn't be consoled. He sat mourning for a very long time. And his students, try as they might, they could not comfort him. It's a long text, but it's an important text. Text 11 on page 104. When the son of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai passed away, his students arrived to console him. Maybe 105 in the English. Rabbi Elazar entered and sat before him. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought, comfort you? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Eliezer said, Adam, first man, had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. How do we know that he accepted consolation? For it is stated in Genesis, Adam was again intimate with his wife. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled, just like Adam. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for Adam as well? The next student, Rabbi Yeshua, entered and asked, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yeshua said, Job had sons and daughters, and they all died in a single day, yet he allowed himself to be consoled. So you should also accept consolation. How do we know that Job was consoled? For he declared, God has given and God has taken. May God's name be blessed. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for Job as well? The next student, Rabbi Yossi, entered and sat before him. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Yossi said, Aaron, the high priest, had two illustrious sons, but they both died in a single day, and yet he allowed himself to be consoled. As it is stated, Aaron kept silent in Leviticus. His silence implied that he was without grievance and accepted consolation. So you should also allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own son, my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for Aaron as well? Rabbi Shimon entered. Master, he said, would you like me to share a thought? Speak, he responded. Rabbi Shimon is the famed Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Rabbi Shimon said, King David had a son who died, and he allowed himself to be consoled. And you should allow yourself to be consoled as well. How do we know that King David was consoled? For it's stated in Samuel, David comforted Bathsheba, his wife, and he was intimate with her, and she bore a son, and he called his name Shlomo, Solomon. So should you, master, allow yourself to be consoled. Rabbi Yochanan retorted, is it not enough that I am grieving my own loss, that you have to make me feel pain for King David as well? So 4 students came in, and they all gave the same idea of someone else had a loss, and they were consoled. You should also be consoled. Then came the 5th student. Rabbi Elazar ben Arach entered. When Rabbi Yochanan saw him, he told his attendant, grab a set of clothing for me and be prepared to follow me to the bathhouse. For Rabbi Elazar is a great person, I will not be able to hold out in the face of his comforting words. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan saying, I know Rabbi Elazar will be able to comfort me, and I'll be able to go shower and leave my mourning. Rabbi Elazar entered, sat before Rabbi Yochanan, and told him, let me share a parable. Your situation is similar to that of an individual to whom the king entrusted an article for safekeeping. Each day the man would weep and wail in fear. Woe is to me, when will I emerge unharmed from the safekeeping role? In other words, the servant was saying, as long as I have to keep this, safeguard this item, I'm very worried. The item can get stolen, the item can break, the item can get scratched, and I can't live a normal life. He wants the king to take this item away from him, and now he'll be able to be relieved that he gave back the item full, healthy, in whatever form that item was supposed to be returned. So Rabbi Elazar continued, you, master, also had a son. He was fluent in the Torah, the prophets, and scriptures, and the Mishnah, the Halacha, and the exegetical teachings, and he passed from this world without sin. You should certainly accept consolation, for you have returned your deposit in perfect condition. Rabbi Yochanan responded, Rabbi Elazar, my son, you have comforted me in a most humane fashion. Why did Rabbi Yochanan's words, why did Rabbi Yochanan accept Rabbi Elazar's words as opposed to the other 4 students? You see, Rabbi Yochanan's message to his first students were very simple. You're telling me other people had losses? That's terrible. They found consolation. I don't understand how they found consolation. Not only I don't understand it, now I'm grieving for their losses as well. I can't get over, not only I can't get over my loss, I'm pained for their loss. Don't come to me and tell me someone else had a grievance. Someone else had a loss. That doesn't help me. That makes things worse. They didn't offer comfort. What Rabbi Elazar did was express this idea that a heart can accept a command, be comforted, feel better. Those things don't help. What does help is trying to commiserate with the heart. It's trying to have this kind of conversation with the heart to help the heart understand how it can move forward. And so Rabbi Elazar he explained two powerful points. He made 2 points, two very, very important points. And that's how Rabbi Yochanan was consoled. What were the 2 points? His first point that he made was that life is a deposit. Rabbi Elazar emphasized that life is not ours, it's God's. Everything that we have, the talents that we have, the opportunities that we have, everything we achieve through our accomplishments, it all belongs to God. We start with 0, and whatever we accomplish throughout life, ultimately, it's a blessing. If we look at life and saying that life is ours, and so when it's taken away from us, we feel like we're cheated. We feel like someone took something from us. But if we understand and we recognize that every moment of life is a gift, is a deposit from God, and we have to return it back to God, our attitude changes from one of entitlement to one of gratitude. Our attitude changes from deep grief to enabling us to move on. That was the first point that Rabbi Elazar was making to Rabbi Yochanan. He was telling him that his son was a deposit from God to him. And he handled it beautifully. And he returned that deposit to its owner in his best way possible. And the second point that he made is that his son had lived a perfect, fulfilled life. He had accomplished a great deal. He mentions he learned Mishnah and the Talmud, the Halacha and the prophets and the scriptures and so on and so forth. Why was he mentioning all those points? He's mentioning all those points is because he was telling Rabbi Yochanan that your son fulfilled his mission to the T. He did exactly what he was put on this world for, and now his mission is completed. He lived a fulfilling life. Yes, to you it may seem that he had passed early, but you know what? That passing early is not early because it's exactly the amount of time that God needed this individual to fulfill his mission in life. His soul lived a full life. Obviously, that can take the place of the literal grief that we have when a loved one passes prematurely. And as a matter of fact, it's something which is engraved on tombstones of those that have passed prematurely. It's a Jewish tradition to engrave on the tombstone that this individual passed prematurely. So it's a deep grief that is still there. But this idea still stands. The idea that life is a deposit. And the second point, that the terms of the deposit are dictated by the mission. And the mission, when it's fulfilled, is when the deposit is returned. And so this idea can help us mitigate the feelings of injustice, the feelings of anger that one may have on the passing of a loved one, and enable them to move forward. And another common feeling that's expressed is the feeling of guilt. Guilt of I should have done better. Guilt of the last thing I said to my loved one shouldn't have been the last thing that I said to them. Had I only known that they were passing, I would have said something different. We had some unfinished business to take care of. We had a dispute that I wanted to take care of. These feelings of guilt can stay with us forever. But as we explained in previous classes, these feelings of guilt are only there if we see it as a last moment, and now we can no longer deal with our loved ones on unfinished business, whatever that business may be. But now that we understand that the soul is immortal, that our loved ones are immortal, we can speak with them, we can live with them, we can discuss with them, we can give them things, albeit not physical things, but we can give them spiritual things. And what guilt? You had unfinished business, go and finish it. Your loved one is still there, still listening to you, still feeling that love that you're giving them, still feeling the remorse you have for something you may have done to them, still feeling the appreciation you're telling them. A parent, we didn't express the immense appreciation we had for them. It's not too late. Go ahead and do it. Your parents are appreciating it every moment. Your loved one is appreciating it every moment. And it's expressed by the great Rabbi Aaron of Karlin, the Hasidic master from the 18th century, on page 108. When children say Kaddish for their parents, it is like sending them regards. When they learn a chapter of Mishnah on their behalf, it's like sending them a letter. And when they fulfill mitzvahs and good deeds for the benefit of their souls, it's like sending them an entire parcel. Stop for a moment. I see some questions came in. Let's see. Who says Shiva, just the kin? What if you are the only one? We're going to get to that right now. Why human souls are more important than angels? I accidentally mentioned last week. Souls are more important than angels because only souls can accomplish what the divine mission is, and that is to fulfill tangible, materialistic mitzvahs here in this physical world. Does Judaism have a belief on predestination as a time needed to fulfill mission determined at birth? That's a very broad question, or a lengthy answer rather. The short answer is yes and no. Does Judaism have a belief on predestination? Somewhat, in some areas, and is a time needed to fulfill a mission determined at birth? I'll have to get back to you on that. I believe so, but I am not certain. Why do mitzvahs to the extreme? Why do mitzvahs to the extreme? Since this may lead to finish our business on earth sooner and God takes the person sooner. No one knows. That's a great question. It's a great question because there's a Yiddish expression that in Yiddish they say, wird älter schneller. He's getting older faster. And that's an expressing this exact idea that if we do mitzvahs too fast, then we're going to fulfill our mission faster than we're supposed to, and God will take our life earlier. But the answer to that concept is we can't do them too fast because God put us on the world and told us what we are supposed to accomplish. And what we're supposed to accomplish every day. And so the fact that we're supposed to put on tefillin every day is not going to make one pass faster than someone who doesn't put on tefillin every day because it's a daily mitzvah. But there may be some people on this world that their soul was put on this world to fulfill one mission, one specific mission, to do one good deed to one person, as we read on Tuesday night in the Torah class, the quote from the 5th Chabad Rebbe, who quoted the Baal Shem Tov, that sometimes a person was put on this world for 70 or 80 years just to do one helping hands, to give one helping hand to one other person, and that's their mission. It's not so much the passing that is hard to accept, but it's when the passing is over a long time period. It's painful, violent, debilitating. Not like a light switch, which would be more tolerable. It seems that the person passing as well as for loved ones. True. True, 100%. And that's all part of the passing. And that's all part of the process, which is why we need some days to process it, and which is why we have the yard site every year, which is why we have a shloshim and a year, in order to enable us to process that prolonged feeling as it moves along. But it's most intense immediately after. And to express and to stress on that last point, following the class, if you'd like, read text 17 on the first appendix on page 115. Where it's a great Reddit post out of all things that expresses that exact concept. A great question just came in that I will not answer now because it's a lengthy discussion. And so I'm just going to put the question out there. If it's all predetermined, then why do we pray for forgiveness? And why do we pray on Yom Kippur that we should have long life? Why don't we just say, God, it's predetermined. You know, this is the amount of years I was allotted. And I'm just going to sit back, relax, and wait till, I don't have to do any mitzvahs. I don't have to do any good because it's all predetermined. It's a great question. And what do we accomplish on Yom Kippur? I will not address it now because it takes, it's a long discussion. We have touched upon it on lessons around the time of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. And so if you'd like a lengthy discussion on that, send me an email following the class and I will follow up with that. Getting back to the class. So now we move on. Once we understand the idea of the Shiva house, now we'll move on to the Shiva etiquette. We understand the need to have a processing time for Shiva. And we'll get to the basic Shiva protocol. Who sits Shiva? The immediate next of kin. Parents, if it's a child that passed, siblings, if the deceased has siblings, if they don't have siblings, then they don't sit Shiva. Children, and if there's only one child, then just that child sits Shiva. And if there are no immediate next of kin, the individual, the deceased, has no parents and no siblings and no children and no spouse, then there isn't anyone who sits Shiva aside from, as we mentioned last class, the soul itself. And so it's still the custom to have a quorum of 10 men be in the Shiva house for an entire week to do the prayers and to have someone say the Kaddish there. What happens in a Shiva home, and once again, this is just a general overview. This is not meant to be in place of a practical study of the laws and customs of Shiva. God forbid if it should ever become applicable. And these are the laws and traditions. We cover the mirrors and pictures that are in the home because some mention that the reason is because we'd like to focus solely on the deceased, not on others, not on our reflection, and not on we don't want that many distractions other than focusing on the deceased themselves. The mourners are to remain in the house of mourning for the entire duration of the 7-day period. Sit on low stools, they don't wear leather footwear, and they avoid listening to music, any music. No shaving or haircuts. No work, not going into work, not doing work virtually. Give it over the business. If someone's the owner of a business, the owner of a firm, give it over to someone else. I recall distinctly my father, who ran a business together with his father, who had become a mourner because his father, my great aunt, had passed away. And so my grandfather had suddenly become a mourner. He gave over the business to my father with a legal document to ensure that the business would be able to remain open. Because if it was my grandfather's business, and he's a mourner, the business is not allowed to remain open. And so someone who's a mourner should abstain from work, avoid Torah study, because the verse tells us that Torah study brings joy to one's heart. And again, this is not a time for joy. This is a time to process the grief. Restrictions on bathing and laundry. Everyone should speak to their own rabbis regarding that. And prayer services in the home. Those are the general laws regarding the Shiva, and understandably also lighting the candles. Customarily, we light 5 candles for the duration of the Shiva, the 7-day candles that are to be lit immediately following the interment. And that is for the 5 categories of the soul that we touched upon in the first class. Comforting the bereaved is an important mitzvah. We have on page 111, text 13. The sages obligated us to visit the sick and console mourners. There are deeds of kindness that one carries out in person and have no limit. Although these are rabbinic ordinances, they fall under the purview of the biblical commandment to love your fellow as yourself. And so Maimonides classifies the visiting of the mourners as a rabbinic commandment, but one that's based on the general Torah commandment of love your fellow as yourself. And so if someone has a question, you know what, I'm uncomfortable or I don't feel like it, or maybe they're not ready for me. Should I call a bereaved person, someone who's sitting shiva? Should I visit them? Maybe I shouldn't visit them. Call, visit, be there for them. As Shmuel mentioned earlier, this is a time when they need you following the interment. They need you to be there. But we have to remember, mourning is personal. Some of the mourners, sometimes mourners will weep, sometimes they'll be more joyful. Don't measure the depth of the love of the mourner to the deceased by what their reaction is. Others won't even cry at all. We're not here to judge. When we visit a shiva house, we are not here to judge because everyone experiences grief differently. So how do we provide comfort? How can we provide comfort? What is the way to comfort the bereaved other than that one line? So the first and really maybe even most important way of comforting is just to be there. Just our presence, being there for the mourners, is the most comforting it can possibly be. Being there even quiet. And as the Talmud states, and the Talmud expresses it on page 112, text 14, the reward for visiting the home of mourning is for the silence. It's not for what you're going to say, because there's nothing really that we can say to comfort them, to comfort a mourner. It's just our presence showing them that we are being there, that we are there for them. That's the most we can possibly say. Not only that, the Talmud takes it, and it's actually in the code of Jewish law, a step further. Not only is our presence the most important, but when it comes to talking, we don't talk until the mourner begins a conversation. Visitors to a mourner's home should not begin the conversation. Text 15. The comforters may not say anything until the mourner opens the conversation. Every mourner reacts to their pain differently. What may be a comforting remark to one mourner may be the worst thing, the most offensive thing we can say to another. And so once the mourner opens the conversation, and we now see what the mourner would like to discuss, we can go ahead and discuss what they're mourning. So some other important points that the Torah tells us about shiva etiquette. Don't attempt to lighten the mood. You walk into a mourning home, you feel it's too sad, you're going to try to say a few jokes to make some people happy. That's not the place for it. Now's the time for them to process the grief, however the mourners see fit. Don't try to lighten the mood. It's not the time. Don't discuss sports, don't discuss the news, don't discuss the comedians, whatever it may be. Now's not the time. It's not a party. It's not a time to avoid the pain. It's a point to process the pain. Don't philosophize. Don't try to explain why. Don't try to bring up important discussions of why God takes the soul, why God does such things. Now is not the time. The time may be right now when we're discussing it on a regular Thursday night. That's the time to philosophize. Not during the shiva. Don't ask anything intrusive. Don't say anything intrusive. Don't say, where were you when he passed? What did they die from? Did they die from cancer or chemo? Did you know in advance? Was it sudden? Did he have life insurance? All these yenta questions are really, really not helpful. And even statements, God only takes the good ones. At least he got to witness the wedding of his grandchild. There's no such thing as at least. Respect the pain of the mourner. Don't try to diminish. Don't tell the mourners what to do. You don't need to. Go visit this one. Don't do that. Don't compare losses. This one had this one had the other thing. Don't do that. But what should you do? Discuss the deceased legacy. Discuss the mitzvahs that they would adhere to. Discuss what they enjoyed doing. It's a time to discuss the positive qualities, the achievements of the department. Why? serves numerous purposes. First of all, it allows the mourners to mourn and to focus on the deceased. It allows them to slowly move from the moment of passing to focus on the gift of what this individual's life was, of what their loved one's life was. And it enables them to focus on the relationship that will continue with the deceased, with the loved one after the passing, by focusing on what they love to focus on. As the Midrash says, text 16, the final word regarding a person is that of the people proclaiming his deeds, commenting so-and-so is upright, so-and-so is God-fearing. When a person departs the world, God says to the ministering angels, see what people are saying about him. If they say that he had been upright and God-fearing, the soul immediately ascends to paradise. So when we talk about our loved ones, and we talk about their achievements, the mitzvahs they would focus on, the goodness or kindness that they've done, it doesn't only do good for the mourners, but it does good also for the deceased themselves and enables them to go immediately to paradise. And I'm just going to mention, because it was asked earlier, we're going to focus on more in next class, but I'd just like to mention that that also includes taking upon ourselves mitzvahs, doing a good deed, a mitzvah, whether it's studying Torah, whether it's putting on tefillin, lighting Shabbos candles, adherence to kosher, whatever mitzvah we may choose in memory of a loved one, that also strengthens our connection with the loved one, because our loved one looks down upon us and sees that we're doing it in their merit, and they now understand that that's what really counts, and so they feel the love that we are giving them through that. But it also, and maybe even more importantly, enables the soul of our loved ones to reap the benefits of those mitzvahs that we're doing. And so when we do something in the merit of a loved one, it's not just a nice cliche, we're doing this in honor and loving memory of, but it actually isn't to the merit of the loved one, that they take that merit, and it enables them to reap the benefits of that merit on high, to reach greater heights, to be in a better place in heaven, and in turn to give us greater blessings to the soul's loved ones. So we see how our actions and our words in this world continue to influence the journey of the soul above.
Rabbi, the sound's not coming through.
Let me try that again. Sorry about that. There we go.
Lesson 3. The Mourning After. 1. Everyone reacts to and deals with grief differently. No two people are psychologically alike, and no two circumstances of death and bereavement are the same. 2. It is a mitzvah to mourn the loss of a loved one. Processing a loss is critical to the healing process, and this is accomplished by shiva, a mandatory period of grieving. 3. The Torah validates and encourages mourning, but only for a prescribed period of time, after which the mourner is enjoined to transition back to normal life. 4. Some ideas that give a mourner the strength to move on. A. The knowledge that the soul lives on and is not diminished by death. B. It is never too late to mend or improve our relationship with the deceased. Though our physical relationship has ended, we can still give him or her spiritual gifts. C. Life is a deposit, and God decides when to give it and when it must be returned. D. For this soul and its unique mission, this constituted a full life. 5. It is a mitzvah to comfort mourners. The most basic principle of comforting a mourner is simply being there. Our presence offers comfort and lessens the loneliness that often accompanies mourning.